Welcome to the Six Hats podcast, where I, Dr. Shami, a lifestyle and nutritional medicine family doctor, will talk about how women strive to find balance each day by juggling their six roles, being a woman, mother, daughter, partner, business owner, and professional. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Six Hats podcast. Now, in this episode, we will deep dive into the importance of building muscle mass and why it's crucial for overall health and not just weight loss. So we're going to learn about hypertrophy, how it impacts your body, and why it's particularly important for women, especially as we age. So welcome back, Gaby Tudorin. So awesome to have you back. We've done a couple of podcasts and it's been so informative. So I'm excited to dive into this one.
Thank you, Dr. Shami. I'm excited to be back. And I think this is a fantastic topic to talk about in a bit more detail.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to share to all our listeners, I've been sort of training with you for over a year now, and I just couldn't believe it in the last sort of 10 days when I did the 1,000 steps. So 1,000 steps is quite a popular spot in Melbourne, well, just the outskirts of Melbourne, and it's quite steep. And normally it takes about, 45 minutes. It's a good steep sort of climb. And I just compared myself for like pre-COVID years ago of doing it and how it was a struggle. And I just couldn't believe how much easier it was. And I actually shared this experience with you, Gaby, because I go, oh my God, this is what muscle mass building does. Like just daily function, just going up hills. Wow, it's so much easier. And you enjoy moving.
Absolutely. That was such a wonderful message to receive, because to me, that's what it's all about. It's improving. I mean, there's obviously so many other benefits from a health perspective. And then if you look at, the aesthetic goals that some people have as well, but just for everyone at every different phase of your life, having that strength and power in everyday movement and function is just the most valuable thing, really, that you could ever need.
Absolutely. So, and that's what we're going to sort of dive into. It's just not about weight loss. It's about function, it's about ease of it, just about enjoying life as well. But a great place to start, Gaby, would be, what are the top 5 hidden benefits of building muscle?
Yeah. So if you look at it from like an overall health perspective, probably the first one that we would look at and discuss is insulin sensitivity. And I'm sure you can add to this, but basically how it works is muscle cells absorb glucose. So when you have more muscle, so the more amount of muscle that you hold, basically the cells better absorb that glucose into your bloodstream, and that reduces your blood sugar levels, as we know. So that's probably the main factor. And that's something that people don't often think about. They think, I want to look a certain way. And, I think that's always the key sort of driver for most. But there's all of these hidden benefits. And I think for a lot of people with that insulin sensitivity, I mean, that's something that you can talk about in a bit more detail than even I can, but, especially with hormonal changes and perimenopause and menopause, it's such a huge factor, and it just explains why it's so important to have more muscle because of that factor. And another important factor with regards to insulin sensitivity is improved mitochondrial function as well. So that's another big one. So as you know, mitochondria is an energy-producing structure, and it basically, with increased muscle mass, it associates an improved function. And again, it's better for effective glucose production and energy production as well. And then it reduces inflammation. So having more muscle, having less chronic inflammation is a part of that with the insulin sensitivity as well.
I loved how you mentioned insulin sensitivity and mitochondrial dysfunction. This is literally what we talk about a lot in our clinic. And something what I'm going to add to that is why, when we think about weight gain, it's actually about hormones and not about calories in versus out. We've got to ditch that. It is all about hormones. So insulin actually tells your body to store fat, and it's correct every time you eat. So I always have this chat with patients. Snacking is a big thing that contributes to and leads to insulin resistance. And what does that mean? Insulin resistant means that insulin's not working as well as it should be. We want it to be sensitive. We want it to be working well. And that means when you eat sugar, carbs, all forms of carbs break down to sugar. So when that happens, we want sugar to be pushed into the cells, which that's the job of insulin. But if it's not working well, it's not pushed into the cells, leads to buildup of fat, which is literally gaining weight.
Yeah, correct.
So it really just breaks down to that. And often we don't link, strength training, muscle mass with
No.
weight loss. And it's all about insulin. And we lose muscle mass as we age from the age of 30. So
Yeah.
that's such an important thing. And I loved what you mentioned about perimenopause, because from the age of 40, as estrogen declines, insulin resistance most likely occurs. So
Yes.
that's where muscle mass is just so vital, especially for women, to take you through the years of
Absolutely.
perimenopause, menopause, to sail through those years, to control that weight as well.
Absolutely. And I just think if you think about it from the perspective that we can obviously do our best to manage our nutrition and do that, as much as we can with each day. But the reality is that, you go out for dinner or you might travel at some points of time in your life, and you're not always going to have control over your nutrition. But the more muscle mass that you have, obviously, the greater capacity for that insulin sensitivity. And therefore, it's actually going to assist you just when you're not, obviously, when you're going through different phases of life, but when you're also not in control of your nutrition as much as you would like to be. So, yeah, it's
Absolutely.
really important.
And you probably see this a lot, where many sort of women, when they're gaining weight and they're feeling quite
Mm,
bad about it, they often go to, oh, I'll do lots of cardio and stop eating. And they almost go starvation mode and stop eat and do
mm.
lots of cardio. And in some women, it actually does not work. It actually makes the whole picture.
Yeah, it actually works against that sort of cause, doesn't it? If you think about it, the more cardio that you do and the less you eat, you actually have muscle atrophy. So, in effect, that's why, yes. And with that, essentially causes less insulin sensitivity
So
in
true. Oh
turn.
my God. And I'm so glad you picked that up, mentioned that, because yes, cortisol, the stress hormone, causes
Mm.
muscle atrophy.
It does as well. So there's that factor, not eating enough calories to sustain your output. That also puts you into, I guess, a high risk factor of muscle atrophy. And then if you add age as a factor, and then perimenopause and menopause as a factor, and the change in hormones, as you just mentioned, the rate of muscle atrophy with every decade after 30 is about, I think, 5 to 7% per decade. So you're up against the odds there. If you're doing cardio and under eating, and then you're under stress, and then you have hormonal changes as well. Yeah, it's a recipe for disaster, really. And you're sort of working against yourself.
And that's why I think strength training is such a great first step towards, if you are thinking about weight loss, it's actually the great first step, because you can start low and then just gradually build. It's just all about consistency, and you
Absolutely.
see results. So, the thought of like, right, I'm going to go for a HIIT class or a boxing class seems like a massive mountain in front of someone, and may not actually be the right step. So the thought about, hey, I'm just going to pick up 2 kilos and do some just gentle exercises as you start, actually is much more powerful. What do you say to that?
Absolutely. And better for function, daily function and movement. So anything is better than nothing in my perspective. I don't think there's any right or wrong with how much you do, but you need to have some sort of resistance that you're using, and really focusing on functional movements is probably key. But that, even just doing a little bit, especially, at any age, but particularly after the age of 30, at least you are, I guess, you're maintaining the muscle that you have, and therefore inhibiting the risk of that atrophy occurring, which is what you want to have happen, if not building more muscle. And, you just said before we jumped on the podcast, even for yourself with training, think about how much strength you've gained even in just the last 6 months. It's just incredible. And it's able to help you with daily function and movement. And it's nothing crazy. It's not like you're going to the gym and it's stressful and you feel overwhelmed by it. It's movement that is, yes, challenging. And yes, your body is placed under stress in that moment, but it's not the same stress as high impact exercise and movement, where you're jumping, you're putting pressure on your joints and ligaments. It's done in a controlled manner. I actually think it's quite, and I don't know, you might find this as well, Dr. Shami, but it's a bit therapeutic. It's sort of a bit of a form of meditation, and because it's controlled movement against the resistance. So you're sort of connecting to your body, and it's actually a really nice feeling. It's not a high stress where there's like music blaring at you and, and lights flashing and you're jumping and your heart rate's, through the roof. It's a much more gentle form of exercise, and it's so much more beneficial from a health perspective as well.
I loved what you said. It is gentle. I just like put my favorite podcast on or music and just zone out because I've got the structure. I know exactly what I'm doing from your guidance. And then it becomes, that repetition. So you know what you're
Yes.
going to next. Absolutely love it. Absolutely love it.
Yes.
So Gabby, let's move on to a couple more benefits.
Yes. So obviously it also increases your metabolic capacity and rate. So your RMR, which is your resting metabolic rate, which is basically the number of calories that your body burns at rest. So it increases your thermogenesis, and it also creates, like, the more muscle that you have, and it also creates a higher protein turnover. So that protein synthesis, where the muscle is breaking down continuously, which also contributes to that higher resting metabolic rate that we're looking for, which is increased metabolism. And another sort of, I guess, subcategory of that is, increased blood and oxygen flow, which also helps oxygenate the fat tissues. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. I don't have much to add to that.
I feel like you've sort of covered it there. So, yeah, it's sort of, yeah. And that's the thing, the cardiovascular style training, like your HIIT style training or even running, as an example, doesn't create that increased metabolic capacity because you burn, yes, you could argue that you burn more whilst doing that activity, say, as an example, running or HIIT training. But after the fact, because of the reduced muscle that you have or that sort of training builds, your resting metabolic rate at rest is lesser than what it is when you have more muscle. So the higher capacity that you have with muscle mass, the higher your metabolic rate. And therefore, from a nutritional perspective, you can actually eat more foods and it sustain, like you're sustained not just your weight, but your strength as well.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And it's almost just makes it much more achievable. Like what I just I mentioned earlier, when you think about, right, I've got to exercise and you think of a really active class, it can be quite overwhelming and almost a blocker to start. And that's why strength training is such an easy way to get started in terms of movement.
Absolutely. It really is. And then I guess another factor is obviously, strengthening your bones and your joints and your ligaments. So obviously with resistance training and weight bearing training, it stimulates mechanical loading on the bones, which triggers basically bone growth, osteogenesis. And as the muscles contract, they pull on the bones, creating microfractures, which stimulate bone remodeling and density to occur. So essentially, whilst you are weight training, it obviously, you're supporting the joints by building muscle around the joints to protect it. But at the same time, you are also enabling and creating more bone density to occur. Does that make sense? So it's a double benefit really for weight training. Again, it's so different to doing your cardiovascular training, running, HIIT training, where it's high impact. And if anything, you're actually putting a lot of pressure and load on the joints. This is gentle training or weight training and hypertrophy training essentially is building muscle fibers to protect the joints.
I love that. And one thing I do want to mention about strengthening bones, many are familiar with the term osteoporosis and, people are quite fearful of it. And especially women, especially postmenopausal, we're thinking about it as estrogen declines. But one thing I do want to mention is the risk of osteoporosis just by sedentary lifestyle. And it is quite scary what the research is saying, you're sitting at 8 to 10 hours and how that is a risk factor for thinning bones. And humans are not designed for sitting for long periods of time. And what I'm seeing now, which I never saw 20 years ago, young men and female men actually in their 40s developing osteoporosis. So what's that about? We used to always think about the postmenopausal woman with osteoporosis, but now we're seeing younger and younger women with osteopenia and moving down the pathway.
It's true. It's true.
You've really got to think about not only the hormones, but also the lifestyle and the impact of stress and cortisol and how many, many of us are having sedentary jobs and we're not designed for it. So,
no, we're meant to move. Our bodies are that's what they're designed for. It's funny you say particularly male patients that you see with that, because essentially another factor when you're looking at it from, like, if you're looking at resistance training, especially with strengthening bones and supporting the bones as well, is actually stimulates a hormonal response with increased testosterone and growth hormone and an insulin like growth factor. So that for men in particular, I mean for females as well, but for men in particular, if they aren't doing much resistance training or movement at all, that would be a hugely contributing factor and probably obviously contribute to a decrease in testosterone, which would in cause affect that to happen.
Yeah, and it's so interesting you say that. I have seen quite a few young men, maybe tiredness, lethargy, and their testosterone is low, and curious what's going on. But I didn't think about muscle mass. That is so interesting. Wow.
Yeah, yeah. And I've written down some facts as well. So basically, a 10% increase in muscle mass can lead to a 2 to 4% increase in bone density. So that's huge, like if you think of it from that perspective. And if you are resistance training consistently throughout, if you look at an entire year, 12 months, it can increase bone density by 1 to 3% per year, which is quite significant.
Wow, that's huge.
Yeah. So it's really important just for general function.
Absolutely. And it's just great for prevention, so if you're hitting, mid-30s into 40s, it's something so important to think about, almost like a priority, because you want to aim to sail through the 50s and just be in the top health that you could ever be.
Absolutely. It's important at any age, but particularly as we get older, because, yeah, as we know, as you get older, we have a lot of deterioration naturally occurring. And if you aren't strong and you don't have muscle to support your joints and body and just daily function, it will only get harder, and if you're not actually working at it consistently, your decline will happen much quicker. It's fine in your 20s. I mean, obviously you've got youth on your side, but you don't have that as the years go on. So it is really important. And it does, I guess, like leading into the next point, and the benefit is it really does help lower the risk of injury. So if you think about it from a very just basic standpoint of having more muscle is essentially like a shock absorber for your joints and external forces. So the more muscle you have, obviously, the better shock absorption, I'll say, that you have as well. And yeah, it's sort of, again, just looking at some statistics with injury prevention in particular, a 10% increase in muscle can reduce the risk of injury by 10 to 20%, which I'm sure that you would, even thinking about your walk the other week, think about just having that strength. And particularly that walk is actually quite challenging. It's uphill for most of it. And then on the way down, it's very steep. Now, if you didn't have the strength and that muscle mass that you've built over the last year, imagine, you sort of take a foot wrong or a step wrong, and you could easily just fall, roll your ankle. But the more muscle that you have, the more proprioceptive muscles that you have, which essentially counteracts that external force, or if you're on an imbalanced surface, from happening. So there's a greater chance that in those situations, or more challenging physical situations, that your body will be able to adapt and handle it better from having more strength, but also having a better and greater sort of sense of proprioception as well.
So important to remind us of all of that. Absolutely. Absolutely. And often when we think about exercise, we think weight, we think looks, we want to look a certain way. But this is why just diving into all the hidden benefits is just so important, because it's actually protecting us, like what you said, not only injury from osteoporosis, from weight management, from mental health, multiple factors.
Absolutely. I'll use myself as an example. I've been training now for over nearly 15 years, probably even more, and consistently every week. I don't really miss a training session, but I can say, touch wood, I have not had an injury in that whole time, not from training, but definitely not externally, not at all. And I think that and a lot of clients that I work with and who have trained for a prolonged period of time, same thing. It's not often that you have anyone come to you and say, I've injured myself or hurt myself. And I have clients that are in their 50s and 60s. And so I think those odds in themselves are quite staggering,
Absolutely. And there's one person I want to mention. I was chatting to a friend and she was saying her personal trainer, his mom is 94, and literally every single day does strength training exercises and still,
I love that.
yeah, and still lives independently, does her
Mm,
own thing, has a social life, lives a vibrant life, and she's 94 and has not missed a day of her strength training program.
that's incredible. How inspiring.
It's so inspiring, and almost have that picture in my mind. I go, "Hey, that's where I want to be."
That's where I want to be too. And I'm sure she feels so like for that age, she probably feels fantastic because she's probably, able to mobilize and move around still, which is just incredible. Wow.
It's so amazing. So, yeah,
Yeah.
on to our fifth benefit.
So essentially a greater sense of mobility as well. And it sort of comes back into what I was sort of leads and interlinks in with injury prevention and bone density. Essentially, the more muscle that you have and in your daily function and movement, the better you will be able, from a proprioceptive perspective, be able to handle that. And again, the muscles around the joints, they're to protect it, and they are stretched and also contracted when you're training hypertrophy. So again, having that capacity muscularity wise, you're able to essentially handle those situations or the risk of injury or falls in a better way.
That's phenomenal. So, Gabby, I'd love to know. I think we were going to talk about how muscle mass helps with weight loss, but I feel like we've probably covered it through our talk about insulin
We've
sensitivity.
sort of digressed onto different.
Yeah, yeah. But I'd love to know how long does it take to build muscle?
That's a very good question.
Yeah, ask that.
How long is a piece of string? So essentially, there's no set time of how long it sort of takes to build muscle. It's a gradual process, hypertrophy. And everyone is so different. There's so many factors that basically contribute to that. What we do find, and it's like a terminology that we use in the industry, we call it newbie gains. So essentially, if you're a beginner and you haven't done much weight training before, obviously your capacity is lower. But with time and very quickly, you can gain quite a lot of strength and see a very large scale of an increase in strength because of the fact that I guess like the baseline is a little bit lower. As you progress and as the more that you train and the more consistently you train over time, months, years, that degree of, I guess, strength and building muscle decreases slightly. So, yeah, so I guess it sort of is a progression, right? But it does take a lot of time and it does take consistency over months and years. You could see, though, initially a huge change in strength within the first 6 weeks to 12 weeks, and then so on and so forth. As you progress, you could probably double your strength within a year. And actually, you're a perfect example of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I was just strength training this morning and I just couldn't believe the weights I was carrying compared to when I first started. I just had to take a moment going, wow, I have literally double, tripled that weight. And it is, I love what you said, it is consistency. It's just turning up every week,
Yeah.
not about a quick fix. It's like not about a quick result.
No, no, you can't get a quick result. And there's many factors that play a part in that. If you want to look at it more holistically, obviously, as I said, your training experience, and then of course the level of consistency that you put into it. But genetics play a part as well. Your training program, so what you're actually doing, and nutrition is a huge contributing factor. So having a higher protein intake is obviously going to expedite the results, and good nutrition around your training is really key. You can train and do a strength or hypertrophy program, but the reality is if you're not taking care of yourself holistically around that, like your sleep, your recovery, your
Those things actually, yeah.
yeah, your nutrition, your level of protein intake, then the rate of muscle growth will be substantially less than what it could be.
Makes so much sense.
Yeah.
Sense.
And I know that you would agree with that.
Completely, completely. Before we
Mm.
wrap things up, I'd love to ask my last question. So, what kind of exercise help build muscle?
So there's no set exercise. There's no magic exercise as such that helps build muscle. But if you're looking at at it from a hypertrophy specific training perspective, where you're looking to increase size and strength at the same time, then you're looking at some key factors. So the first is progressive overload, which is gradually increasing the weight or resistance and reps over time, which stimulate more muscle growth. The volume and frequency. So that sort of looks like, how much volume, number of sets and reps that you're doing over a given week, the frequency and the muscles that you're targeting, again, rest and recovery, and the exercise selection. So there's no one exercise that builds muscle. It's about, I guess, having someone, a trained professional, a coach, an exercise physiologist to look at you and go, okay, what do we need to work on? And have it individualized for you, to make sure that you're getting the maximum out of it. And it's not just a generic plan. They can be okay to start with, but if you have an injury or a postural misalignment or, whatever the circumstances are, it's important to have the correct and appropriate exercise selection and prescription for you and what you need. But your general sort of push-pull movements are always important, compound movements, isolation movements of different muscle groups. So you sort of want to, whatever you choose to do and whatever your capacity is within a week, so you only can do 1 session a week or 2 sessions a week, then you're essentially wanting to have enough volume and progression of all the muscle groups essentially in that 1 or 2 sessions. So you'd be looking at a full body training split with, as I said, compound movements, pull, push, isolation movements. And if you were able to do, 3 or 4 sessions a week, then you could do a split program where you're targeting specific and different muscle groups throughout each session plan. So again, there's not really one specific exercise, but I think this is where it's important to, find someone that can actually help you and create the correct and appropriate plan for you to work off initially.
Amazing. Amazing. Thank you so much for your time today, Gaby. So
You're so welcome. Thank you so much.
And where can people find you?
So I am Glutes by Gab on Instagram, or my website is allegrahealthandfitness.com.au.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Gaby.
Thank you.
Remember that this is general advice only. Please see your healthcare professional for more information. So what's your take-home message today? Remember, it's all about progress and not perfection. And are you suffering from stress? Visit the Usawa Learning Hub on usawa.com.au for more resources on how to de-stress, re-energize, and reclaim your health. Enjoy the journey.